Okay, so a recap from the last video then. We have created what we called instance methods. And these two are instance methods. They are specific to the instance, to the object that's using them. As a result, they know their own, that instance knows its first name because it's a specific instance of student 1 or a specific instance of student 2. And so when we run the method, this method knows, oh, I'm a instance of Lilo, so therefore I know how to print my name. So I don't have to send it the name, it automatically knows because it's a method of that instance. It's part of that blueprint. And then we also discovered overloaded methods where we have two methods or more. You could have lots of them. It doesn't have to just be two. We have two methods and they have the same name. They're both instance methods. And they are different because they receive different arguments or parameters in this case. So this one has a string that expects to receive and this one expects to receive nothing. And so therefore, technically, they're different. Now, just to kind of reiterate this point, I could not have a string and say first name, for example. Now I have a duplicate because both of these are expecting a string. So even in your mind, if you're thinking, yeah, but it's different information, well, the compiler doesn't know. It just knows that this one's looking for a string and this one's looking for a string, so that's a no-no. If you maybe on the other hand it's looking for two strings, last name, for example, then that is no longer a conflict because now this one is looking for two pieces of data and this is only looking for one string. But let's go back to where we were. And that was that this particular instance method was not wanting to receive anything. Okay, so now we're going to deal with a topic called constructors, and that actually builds on our idea of methods, instance methods, as well as overloads. Okay, what is a constructor? Well, turns out that a constructor is actually a method that runs at the moment that this student or the object is created from the class. In other words, that's why we have this little parentheses, because we're actually running a method. If you don't define a method to run, or what we call a constructor, then a default method is run automatically behind the scenes and we don't have to deal with it. I don't know what it is. I don't see it. It just is working and life is great. Well, let's just show you what a default constructor looks like before we ever do anything. So let's do this. Let's create a constructor. So I use the word public because it has to be available to everybody that wants to utilize my class. So I'm going to create a public and you name the constructor the same name as your class. So in this case, student matches case and everything. So we do opening and closing parentheses and then we have our open and closing curly braces. This is what a default constructor looks like. Not very impressive by itself. It doesn't really look like anything. But what's happening is it's running a method. That's what these parentheses are. So this method automatically runs when we create this instance of a student. And this particular method is not receiving any data. It's not doing anything. So an instance of that object was created. Nothing exciting there. Let's just see it run. Right line. And I'm just going to put method, or let's see, object, student object. That sounds better. Student object created. Okay, so what else do I have printing? Let's undo all these other prints so I only have two things. So we're creating two objects. So each time this object is created, let's just watch it run. So I'm going to debug it, debug, start without debugging. It's going to get to here and it didn't stop. Oh, I should have debugged it. Start debugging. All right, let's try that. Fantastic. All right, so we're about to create a new student. Yay! And you can see that automatically the constructor is run. We don't have to worry about it. It's just going to happen. The right line is going to happen, showing us that that student was created, and then life is going to go on. So we'll see the second one create. Yep. So at the time an object is instantiated, at the time we create a new object, our default constructor is automatically run for us. We don't have to worry about it. Okay, so let's run it from start without debugging. We can actually see it. Sure enough, both of those worked. Okay, so now we get the concept of constructors per se, kind of. So if you leave this off, you don't put one on, one is automatically created for you that looks like that behind the scenes, and you don't have to worry about it. But if you want to start doing things, and we'll see why that might be important in a minute, you're going to want to create your own constructors. And as soon as we create a constructor of any kind, in other words, we don't expect the default constructor to run, we are now in total control of the constructors, of the methods that are being run. I don't understand what you mean by that. Okay, well, let's continue on for a moment. Okay, let's think about our constructor in the context of overloads like we did here with our method. In other words, let's do a public student. So I'm creating another constructor of the same name, but this time I want to have the name. Let's just make this first name for less confusion. Okay, so now I have the ability to create an instance of an object in two different ways. I can either create an instance of a student without having to send anything into my constructor, my method, or I can create a object sending in a piece of information that I can now initialize one of my variables with. So in other words, at the time I create the object, I want to have my first name given the value. In other words, let's see, f name is equal to first name. Okay, so let's just watch this, where I'm going to get rid of all of this other stuff to try and make it clear. All right, so when I create student 1, I can either create this one, which will print out, let's just watch it work. So that's going to print out student object, I think. That's going to print out just student object created. Yes, it sure did. But if I send it some data, in other words, I ask the user at the time, what is the student's name? And they typed in at the keyboard Lilo. I could also send in that information. I'm going to cancel that one out. And so now when this student is created, let's just print it out. Right line, student 1 dot first name. Okay, and so I don't want, well, it doesn't matter, we're not using the last name, but this is just for demonstration. So this time when I run it, let's see what happens. So if I hit debug and start, let's just debug it so that way we watch it work. So I'm going to click on that, debug, start debugging. And now when we get to creating the new student, we can watch it hit the second constructor. So at the time it initiates the object, it runs one of the two constructors that I've created. And one of them here has a string, and so first name is sent over. And so we can watch first name get assigned. Let's see that happen. So we can watch first name is now going to get assigned a value of Lilo. And so now Lilo has an F name that we initialized at the time we created the object. And so now when we run this, we should actually see a console that has student1.firstname. And let's just do it without debugging, and we should be able to see Lilo. So constructors then give us the ability to initialize our fields at the time that our object is created. That's a lot. Let me add one more thought just to keep you confused and frustrated here. Well, hopefully unconfused and unfrustrated. So I said that if we create constructors, I no longer have the compiler no longer creates a default constructor for me behind the scenes. In other words, if I leave off, let's do this. I told you that a default constructor is a constructor that has no parameters. So let's take this off. Let's control exit for a moment. I have a constructor now that says that I need, in order to create a student, I need to have a first name. Okay, I can no longer create a no argument default constructor. In other words, let me make that in English. I can now no longer create a student without sending data, because I have now overwritten the ability to create a student without any arguments or any parameters in it. The only way I can create a student now, the only way that I can create a student is if I send it over some kind of a string. Okay, so I've taken away, by creating any kind of constructor, you take away that no argument constructor that gets created automatically for you. If you still want to give your user the ability to create a student without having to send data, in other words, giving them that option, then you need to put in your own no argument default constructor. So now I can send over a student that has no arguments being sent, no data being sent in, and I can create an object now without any data. Or, because I have an overloaded constructor, I can also send one over with, let's change up the name. I'm getting tired of typing in, Stretch Armstrong. Who is old enough to remember Stretch Armstrong? Doesn't matter. So now I can create a initialized student when I create this object. That's a lot to get your hands on, but that's what constructors are. Constructors run at the time that is a method that runs at the time that we create our object or create our instance of our class.